He raised his glass and smiled, the kind of smile people use to hide cruelty. To Emma, Kenneth said, may she finally have a stable family, something her sister could never give her. Laughter rippled through the ballroom, but I didn't laugh. My name is Abigail, and the man humiliating me in front of 200 guests was about to find out what it cost to bury the truth. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? The one who carries the weight while others take the credit? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I did not move. I stood there, a silent figure of steel against the fragile crystal of the glass observatory. The snowy Seattle skyline stretched out behind Kenneth, indifferent and cold, just like the man standing at the head table. Every chandelier in the room glinted like a fracture in a window pane. I could feel the eyes of 200 strangers on me, their amusement a dull pressure against my spine. Kenneth Harrington was 65 years old, polished, wealthy, and fundamentally hollow. He stood there in his custom suit, his gold watch catching the light as he sipped his expensive wine. He thought he was the architect of this moment. He thought he was the one in control. He had just used his daughter-in-law's wedding toast to call me a failure, an unstable influence, a burden my sister was finally shaking off. But I was not looking at Kenneth. I was looking at the structure. As a structural architect, I do not see rooms. I see load paths. I see tension and compression. I see exactly where a building is most likely to fail. And right now, Kenneth was standing directly on a fault line he did not even know existed. Emma sat beside him, her face as pale as her white gown. Her smile was trembling, a tiny flicker of nerves that no one else noticed. She looked at me with eyes full of a pleading fear, desperate for me to just stay quiet. For 20 years, I had been her load-bearing beam. I had absorbed every shock, every pressure, and every bit of weight so she would not have to feel the floor drop beneath her. Kenneth's voice cut through the uneasy silence that followed the laughter. A lovely young woman who will finally have a stable family, he repeated, his smirk deepening, something she clearly never had growing up. I rose slowly. The sound of my chair creaking against the marble floor was louder than the jazz band. I did not cry. I did not feel my face burn with humiliation. Instead, I felt a clinical clarity settle over me. My anger was not loud. It was structural. It was a balance sheet that finally needed to be reconciled. Mr. Harrington, I said softly. My voice carried across the room, steady and precise. Do you even know what stability costs? Silence swallowed the ballroom. Kenneth blinked. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered his mask of arrogance. Ah, he murmured. The sister speaks. I smiled, but it was not a kind expression. It was the look of an engineer who had just found the critical point of failure in a blueprint. He thought this was about pride. He thought this was a petty family squabble over a rude comment. But this was about foundations. And his was about to crack. I sat back down, calm as stone. I did not need to shout. I did not need to make a scene. In my clutch, I could feel the weight of my father's drafting pencil, its metal edges worn smooth by 20 years of grief. Kenneth had built his empire on broken beams and stolen lives, and he was about to find out that the truth has a way of asserting itself, no matter how much concrete you pour over it. I looked at Kenneth. His eyes were hard, the color of cold slate. He did not understand that he had just committed a structural error. In his world, words were cheap, and insults were just tools for social masonry. But in my world, everything has a weight. Every lie is a stress point. Every omission is a missing bolt in a bridge that is supposed to carry a heavy load. Emma's hand was still gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were white. She was terrified of the silence. She had spent her entire life trying to be the perfect facade for a building that was rotting from the inside. And she thought my voice, my simple question, was the thing that would cause the collapse. She did not realize the collapse had started 20 years ago. I felt the weight of my father's drafting pencil in my hand. It was the only tangible asset I had left from a life that Kenneth Harrington had liquidated for his own profit. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had provided the emotional capital, the labor. and the invisible support that kept Emma standing while Kenneth was busy mining our tragedy for his fortune. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades. Kenneth cleared his throat. The sound was dry, like shifting gravel. Stability, he said, his voice regaining its practiced confidence, is something you obviously have not achieved, Abigail. Look at you. A small-time engineer with more bitterness than bank balance. You are an eyesore at this wedding, a fracture in the perfect image my son and your sister are trying to build. I did not blink. I did not let the heat of his words reach my core. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I was measuring him. I was checking the tolerance levels of his arrogance. Kenneth Harrington thought his power was an inherent property, like the hardness of steel. He did not realize it was a leased asset. And I was the one holding the eviction notice. You talk about stability, Mr. Harrington, I said, but you have built your entire life on a sinkhole. You have traded safety for speed and integrity for a gold watch. You think the ground beneath you is solid because it is covered in marble? But I have seen the blueprints. I know what is buried under the floorboards. The night the high-rise collapsed, steel claws at the edges of my vision like a jagged piece of rebar. I was not at a ballroom in Aspen or an observatory in Seattle then. I was 14 years old, standing behind a cold chain-link fence, my hands frozen against the metal, while ambulances wailed into the dark. The air did not smell of vintage wine or expensive perfume. It smelled of pulverized concrete and the acrid dust of a dream being crushed. They said no one was left inside, but I knew my parents had not made it out. I heard the sirens, the frantic shouting, and the low, ominous rumble of shifting debris that sounded like a building exhaling its final breath. The next morning, the headlines told a story designed to soothe the public. Natural quake causes tragic accident, they said. But I walked into the Harrington construction office with that article folded in my hand and a truth burning in my gut. I did not see an accident. I saw a crime scene. A man behind the mahogany desk did not even look up at the grieving teenager in front of him. You should move on, kid, he told me. Harrington paid enough. He did not see me snatch the internal safety report off his desk before he could file it away. The ink was faint, but one line burned through the page like a laser. Approved for cost reduction, K. Harrington. That was the day I stopped believing in accidents. It was the day I realized that some men built their empires on the bones of the people who trusted them. For 20 years, I carried that silence and the weight of parents who never came home. I stopped being a child and became a component. I built bridges by day and raised Emma by night, feeding her on noodles and borrowed dreams while I calculated the cost of every cent we spent. I watched her learn to draw and dream, her laughter echoing in the cheap apartments we called home, while I learned to stop feeling and start auditing. I was the silent protector, the load-bearing beam of her life, while Kenneth Harrington was busy laundering our tragedy into his legacy. He built his sterile, glass-walled world on the $6,400,000 of insurance money that was meant for the families of the victims. He thought he had buried the truth under 50 floors of luxury real estate. But foundations do not lie. They just wait for the pressure to reach the breaking point. Now, as I sit at this table, the photo of our parents sits on my desk at home, the light flickering across their faces like fire trapped behind glass. I look at Kenneth and I do not see a tycoon. I see a man who removed the supports. I see the man who killed my parents for a wider profit margin. He thinks he is giving Emma a stable family, but I know better. I have spent 20 years becoming the only person who can show her that the ground beneath her feet is not just hollow, it is stolen. Kenneth did not apologize for his toast. Men like him do not believe in apologies, they believe in settlements. He signaled me toward a private lounge near the observatory's edge. The air inside felt sterile and pressurized, smelling of expensive leather and heavy, unearned power. He pulled a checkbook from his inner pocket and scribbled a number with a gold fountain pen. $100,000. He slid it across the marble table toward me. Take it, Abigail, he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. Consider it a relocation fee. A way for you to start over somewhere else and leave Emma to her new life. You are an eyesore here, a jagged piece of the past that she is trying to smooth over. I looked at the check. To Kenneth, this was a simple business transaction. He thought my silence was a commodity he could buy at wholesale. He did not realize that my compassion had been a luxury his family had overdrafted for decades. My silence was not a sign of peace. It was a debt he had been accruing with compound interest. He laughed then, a dry sound that did not reach his eyes. Your little architecture firm, he said, shaking his head. It is a hobby, Abigail. You spend your days measuring cracks in old brick buildings while I am shaping the skyline of this city. You are an amateur playing with blueprints in a world built on bank statements. You do not belong in this room, and we both know it. He wanted me to feel small, but all I felt was the precision of my own clarity. For 20 years, I had carried the weight of Emma's happiness on my shoulders, terrified that one wrong move would cause her world to cave in, just like that high rise. I had lived in a prison without bars, a cage of my own making where I traded my voice for her safety. I thought that by keeping the truth from her, I was protecting her. But in reality, I was just reinforcing the illusion that Kenneth Harrington was a man of honor. I was a survivor, but my survival had been a subscription to his lies, and I was the one footing the bill. I did not pick up the check. I did not push it back. I just looked at the signature, that jagged, arrogant K. Harrington. It was the same handwriting I had seen on that cost reduction report 20 years ago. I was not a burden to be paid off. I was the auditor he had invited into his home. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch until he began to shift uncomfortably. He thought he was buying my exit. He had no idea he was actually funding the final stages of his own liquidation. I rubbed my eyes, not out of exhaustion, but to sharpen my focus. There was no sadness left in me, no panic, no lingering hope for a family that never existed. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Kenneth thought he was the architect of my sister's future. He did not realize that he was standing on a failure line, and I was the only one who knew exactly when the ground was going to give way. I walked away from the check and the man who thought he could buy my dignity for $100,000. I did not need his money. I needed his records. As I stepped out of the pressurized lounge and back into the cool Seattle night, the city lights below did not look like jewelry. They looked like a grid of vulnerabilities. I was not a worthless burden or an eyesore. I was a precision instrument Kenneth Harrington had failed to calibrate. The wedding dress was still hanging by the door of my guest room when I returned to pick up my things, already covered in a fine layer of dust. It was a symbolic marker. My time as a silent observer, a sister who just wanted to belong, was over. I was not interested in a seat at their table anymore. I was interested in who owned the wood the table was built from. I met Lennox an hour later at a nondescript office building in the business district. No crystal chandeliers here, just the hum of high-end servers and the smell of stale coffee. Lennox was a federal lead investigator, a man whose face was as unreadable as a redacted file. He did not offer a toast. He offered a seat in front of a monitor. For 5 years, I had been a ghost in Harrington Construction's machine. I had spent every spare hour mapping the stress points, glass points, and failure lines of Kenneth's corporate empire. I was not just a small-time engineer measuring cracks in brick walls. I was an undercover auditor for a federal task force, mapping the exact trajectory of a man who thought he was untouchable. Lennox tapped a key, and a complex web of financial routes appeared on the screen. It looked like a structural blueprint, but the load paths were made of offshore accounts and wire transfers. Abigail, we have found the entry point, he said, his voice as dry as limestone. The Rocky Ridge project was not just a construction site. It was a laundering facility. I leaned in, my internal monologue silent for the first time in weeks. Anger had been replaced by a clinical, lethal focus. Kenneth thought he had buried his past under 50 floors of luxury glass. He did not realize that I had been digging for 5 years. The conflict had officially shifted. This was no longer a family drama about an ungrateful daughter-in-law. This was a professional liquidation. We began cross-referencing the site reports with the insurance payouts from 20 years ago. Every discrepancy was a crack. Every forged signature was a point of failure. Calm, factual, precise. We were no longer talking about hurt feelings. We were talking about a federal indictment. Kenneth Harrington wanted to show me what stability cost. Now, I was going to show him the price of a total collapse. Lennox did not move. He stared at the monitor like it was a failing support beam. The data did not just show a crime, it showed a structural flaw in Kenneth Harrington's humanity. $6,400,000. That was the exact amount of the insurance payout from the high-rise collapse 20 years ago. It had not been lost to lawsuits or administrative fees. It had been siphoned off, unit by unit, into a series of shell companies. But the numbers did not just show where the money had been. They showed whose hands were holding the ledger now. Emma's name flashed on the screen in cold digital blue. Kenneth had not just welcomed her into his family, he had turned her into his fall girl. Every illegal transfer, every forged document for the Rocky Ridge project, every cent of that stolen $6,400,000 was linked to accounts set up in her name. He was not giving her a stable family. He was giving her a prison sentence. I sat there, my mind running through the stress points of this new discovery. Kenneth was laundering his past sins through his son's bride. If the federal task force closed in, Kenneth would be safe on his vineyard, while Emma became the face of the collapse. She was his failsafe, his structural insurance. I did not cry. I did not ask how a human could be so calculated. I just looked at the photo of our parents on my desk and felt a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. This was the kill shot. This was the piece of evidence that removed any remaining path to redemption for Kenneth Harrington. He was not just ungrateful or arrogant. He was a predator who had killed our past and was now trying to cannibalize our future. Justice always breaks something, and tomorrow, it was going to break his entire world. I reached into my bag and pulled out an elegant silver frame. It was a wedding gift, a hollow gesture for a hollow man. I placed a glossy photo of the collapsed high-rise inside. But behind the glass, faintly visible only when the light hit it at a certain angle, was a digital overlay of the offshore transfers to the Bahamas. On the back of the frame, I used my father's drafting pencil to engrave one final line. Foundations do not lie. Kenneth Harrington wanted to bury people with paper. Now, I was going to sign his fall with the very documents he thought would save him. I looked at Lennox and gave a single clinical nod. It was time. Let the ground collapse. The observatory in Seattle is blindingly white, the winter sun reflecting off the glass with a sharpness that feels like a physical edge. 1:45 p.m. Kenneth Harrington stands again, his glass of red wine held high like a scepter. He looks at Emma and Dylan, his eyes reflecting the artificial glint of the chandeliers. To the happy couple, he says, his voice projecting through the silence. May your marriage stand stronger than some foundations we have seen before. A ripple of laughter moves through the room, predictable and hollow. I rise slowly, my silver dress catching the light like a surgical blade. You talk about foundations, Mr. Harrington, I say, my voice cutting through the static of the crowd. But do you even know what keeps the ground stable? Kenneth smirks, the look of a man who still thinks he owns the room. An engineer's lesson, is it? I set my glass down hard. It makes a sharp, final sound against the white linen. You built your empire on hollow ground, I tell him, and I am here to make sure it finally collapses. I slide the silver frame across the table toward him. He takes it with a frown, his gold watch glinting. As he opens the wrapping, the digital screen inside flickers to life. His phone buzzed in his pocket at the exact same second. His face drains of color, the gray of old ash replacing his polished confidence. Behind him, the massive wedding screen, the one that was supposed to show a montage of their life, starts flashing headlines. Harrington Construction, under federal investigation. Embezzlement, insurance fraud, $6,400,000 stolen from victims' families. The documents, the transfers, and the forged safety signatures are laid bare for every guest to see. Dylan steps forward, his voice a roar of disbelief. You used my name for this? You used Emma's? Kenneth said nothing. He could not. He looked at the room and realized that his authority had evaporated the moment the numbers changed. I realized then that his power had never been a part of him. It was just a suit he had rented with stolen money. He was suffering from the ultimate narcissistic injury, the illusion of power from an empty wallet. This is the reality for men like Kenneth. They do not have an internal structure. They confuse having wealth with being a person of value. Because he had wealth, he believed he was a leader. Because he had control, he believed he was a god. But power, rented by money, is as fragile as glass. When the funds are frozen, the person inside is revealed to be nothing more than a hollowed out frame. He slumped into his chair, his wine spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. He looked around at the strangers he had spent millions to impress, and all he saw was disgust. He was no longer a tycoon. He was just a man caught in a lie. I stepped forward, looking directly at my sister. My parents died because he chose profit over safety, I said softly. Today, truth weighs more than his gold. Walk away, Emma. Emma did not hesitate. She took Dylan's hand and they walked out of the glass cage, leaving the man who had tried to build their happiness on a foundation of theft. I watched the cameras click, knowing that by morning, the image of his collapse would be the only thing left of his legacy. It was lethal precision. It was justice. Rain traced thin silver lines across the windows of my new office. The city outside was a blurred watercolor of gray and blue, but inside, everything was sharp and clear. The television in the corner murmured about the ongoing trial of Kenneth Harrington. He was being held without bail, his assets frozen, his sterile empire dismantled floor by floor. The $6,400,000 he had siphoned away was finally moving back to where it belonged, allocated for restitution to the families he had exploited. It was not just about the money. It was about the fact that for the first time in 20 years, the ground actually held. The Patton Memorial Trust was officially established yesterday. It would not just be a monument of stone. It was a living foundation providing legal and structural aid for families affected by corporate negligence. We were building something to last, a legacy that was not paid for with silence or bones. Emma came to see me this morning. She did not have her white gown or her trembling smile. She looked like herself again, steady, quiet, and finally free of the burden of lies. She told me she was naming her first daughter Clara, after the name I had carried in silence for so long, to remind her that true stability is built from the truth. We stood on the balcony of the new foundation headquarters, looking out at the city we were helping to rebuild. I looked down at my desk. My father's drafting pencil sat there, its worn metal catching the soft light. I had spent my life trying to be a component in someone else's machine, a silent protector, in a house of cards. But now, I realized I was the architect of my own peace. Justice does not roar when it finally arrives. It settles quietly, like the earth after a quake, finding its new level. This is my letter to you, the ones who have always felt like the invisible ones. The ones standing on the edge of the room while others take the credit. I know the weight you carry. I know the silence of being the load-bearing beam that no one bothers to thank until the roof starts to sag. You are told that your silence is weakness, that your independence means you do not need help, and that your value is only measured by how much weight you can absorb. But I want you to hear this. You are the foundation. The people who try to dim your light or call you a burden are usually the ones whose own structure is made of glass and stolen marble. You do not need their invitation to be extraordinary. You do not need their permission to exist fully. Stop waiting for them to notice the work you do and start realizing that you are the one who owns the ground you stand on. Reclaim your narrative. Build your own sanctuary. Because when the hollow empires finally fall, you will still be standing. If this story reminded you that you are the load-bearing beam of your own life, please like and share it. Subscribe for more stories of justice and restoration.